All right, so I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. I was just at JS Heroes, which was also a beautiful event. I was here last year for JS Heroes as well. Romania is actually super awesome, and I'm really excited to be back, especially at this hotel, which is really beautiful. And thank you, Florin, for organizing such a great conference. Everyone give a round of applause to the organizers. Thank you. Okay. I know you hate audience participation, but I'm going to show you 2 code samples, and what I need you to do is raise your hand for which code sample is cleaner, okay? I'm going to show you A and B, and then I'll ask you, and you can only vote once, okay? So which one of these 2 code samples are clean? I'm going to pause for just a second. Okay. How many people think A is clean? Some people, yeah? How many people think B is clean? Okay, some people. All right, let's do another one. Which one is clean? Okay, A, yeah, about a third of you, and then B, again, more people, great, okay. Now, here comes the part where you can just yell at me. What does this do? Does anybody know? You can yell things. It's cool. Bitcoin mining. No, it's not Bitcoin mining. Anyone? Anyone? Educated guess? Checks what? It checks the user agent. That's exactly right. It checks whether or not you're on a mobile device or not. Cool. Okay. So a lot of you knew that, right? Tons of you knew that. Okay, so how many of you have heard this phrase? You don't need comments if you write clean code. Yeah, like a lot of people, right? There's a book called Clean Code by Robert C. Martin, which kind of popularized this idea that if you write clean code, you actually don't need comments. And then some people disagree with this book, right? So there's people who are like on the side of clean code equals no comments, and there are some people on the side of like, no, that's total, bull dunk, which is an American word, maybe, and say, that's not true. But what I would say is that I'm not sure it's either way. I actually don't think that conversation is nuanced enough. I don't actually believe that this is a Boolean. I don't think that it's either yes, clean code needs no comments, or comment everything. I think the conversation needs to be taken a step further. And so what I want to talk about today is how code can describe how, but it cannot explain why. And this is not a new idea. This wasn't just like invented here. This is a concept that other people have brought up too. There are times where code cannot explain something, or it cannot explain concisely why you're doing something. And so all of that said, there's no correct or one reason to write a comment. I believe that our collective discourse around this, about code comments, is a little too shallow. There are good and bad comments. You can make your code bases more legible, and you can also be misled by comments. They can guide us, and they can also be a crutch. So for that reason, today, we're going to discuss the art of comments. My name is Sarah Drasner. I'm known as Sarah Edo on Twitter. If you're familiar with the framework Vue.js, I'm a core team member for that. I also write for CSS Tricks. And we're going to break down comments, code comments, the good and the bad. We're going to go through many different examples of what are good code comments and what are bad code comments to kind of discuss this in a little bit more depth than just a Boolean, right? Great. So what is the why? Many examples of good code comments can fall under this category. Code explains what you'd like the computer to take action on. You'll hear people talk about declarative programming versus imperative programming. When you're talking about imperative programming, you're talking about describing everything as steps in a recipe, and then declarative is literally telling the computer, I'd like this to happen. Code comments can be the same. Code comments can also break things down in a more declarative manner. So if I see something like this, we had to write this function because the browser interprets everything as a box. This doesn't explain what the code below it will do, but it doesn't explain what the actions we will take. If you found a new, more elegant way of describing this action, you could rewrite that code and actually not mess with this comment at all. You could feel confident in doing so because your code is likely to be the solution to this without breaking down all of the hows. So because of this, less maintenance is required, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. So if you found a better way of writing this, you probably wouldn't need to rewrite this comment. You could also quickly understand whether you could rewrite another section of the code for the same functionality and make those steps for a whole. So the funniest version of this that I've seen is, how many people know what React is? Most people? Yeah. So the manager of React wrote this comment, Sophie Alpert. So there's just one line of code here, right at the bottom there. She's explaining there's this particularly gnarly Facebook bug that she spent ages trying to figure out. And it turns out that the solution to this gnarly Facebook bug is just one line of code. But because she spent so long debugging it, and whole teams at Facebook spent so long debugging it, that she wrote this long comment describing all of the reasons why that thing had to exist. This is longer than the README for most of my GitHub repos. That's kind of shameful also. But this is really useful. Why? Because the bug she's referring to is really hard to explain with that line of code. You can't understand the nuance. Another thing is clarify what's not legible by humans, like that long piece of regex. Who knows what that's for? What is that? Nobody, right? Yeah, of course not. What about this one? No. So this one targets Firefox versions 2 through 3. This one targets Chrome, like very specific Chrome, Safari, and Opera versions. And the thing about this is, I've actually written code like this. I've actually needed code that looked like this in order to target really specific browsers. In order to keep yourself from thinking that you were high that day, or someone else who's maintaining your code to think you took some mushrooms on the way to work, it's good to comment this stuff, because there's no person on the planet who's going to read that long block of regex we just saw, or this, and go, oh, you know what? I bet this is like Opera Mini, lower versions of, no, that's not going to happen. So this is a really good way of commenting too. Okay, who's smart? We are. Yeah? Who writes clean code? We do, yeah? But the problem with clean code and that concept is it's very subjective. When I asked all of you to raise your hands for those functionally equivalent pieces of code in the beginning, you all were indecisive, And every time I give this talk, same story. Everybody's not sure. It's because clean code is not necessarily something that's just written in sand. This is the one true way of writing code, and we all might disagree. There's even clean code that I thought was clean 5 years ago in my career that I would read now and say that's not clean. So this is very difficult premise to rely on for saying, oh, I write really clean code, I'm super smart, and so then I therefore never need to write comments for other people. That can be a bit of a crutch too. So another way of thinking about this is that sometimes we all have deeper knowledge in different areas. Some people work on teams like this where our skill sets are pretty aligned. And in that case, yeah, maybe you need less comments because everybody comes from the same kind of background. But what if you're on a team like this, where skill sets are a little bit more divergent? And it might seem like I'm saying you should only work with people with the same skill set, but look at how much ground that Venn diagram covers. It covers way more ground. So if people are from different backgrounds, they might not have the same experience with code that you do, right? Or what if you have juniors or interns, or you're training people and they don't really necessarily know all of the pieces of maybe a sprawling code base. I used to work on a really big legacy gigantic app, and some of the things that we needed code comments for were just like, why is there backbone next to Angular? I don't understand why these two frameworks are next to me. Oh, it's because of a product release many years ago, that kind of thing. So this is a good idea when you have divergent skill sets as well. Comments can be like chapters of a book. Now, these are not very long examples because I need to fit them on a slide, but if you have bigger blocks of code, this can be a thing. If you think about a novel, It would be the same amount of information if you had chapters and paragraphs or if you didn't. If it was just squished down and everything was just compressed, it would be the same information, it would be the same novel. But we do add paragraphs and chapters and indexes so that we can find our place later, so that we can pace ourselves, so that we can understand and our eye can scan through the whole document. So there are times when you have a bigger block of code that you can separate out into sections. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh, but we have imports and modules and we can break things down into smaller pieces. That's absolutely true, and thank God for that, right? But you sometimes necessarily get to a part where you just need a bigger block of code. And that's when something like this can be super helpful to someone reading your code or maintaining it in the future. A guide to keep the logic straight while writing the code. So get the request from the server, give us an error if it failed, do X thing with that request, format the data like so. This one's really interesting because it can be a bad comment too. This is really, really cool when you're writing something. So if I have to write a really big, gnarly piece of logic, I will write these kind of notes to myself, break down what I need to do, and then inside each of those comments, I'll start writing what the functionality needs to be. So I break down the things that need to happen, and then I make it happen in between those code comments. That's super useful for me to keep track of where I'm going if it's a really big thing, yeah? But if I leave them in there, in the code base as is, they're actually an anti-pattern because they're just describing the how of what the code does. And then the person has to reread the same thing twice in two different formats. That's not super helpful. That's actually kind of time wasting. So my suggestion here would be definitely do this. If that's helpful to you as a reminder of how to break things down, how to suss things out, how to keep the logic straight, especially for a big piece of logic, then that's really great. But revisit it once you've written it and go back and say, do I need a comment? Maybe I don't need a comment at all. Or could this comment be expressed more declaratively? Like we talked about before, how can I rewrite this so that it's not describing the how and it's rather talking about what is the why, like we said before? Great. So this is okay to refactor. For those of you who've worked in production apps, this happens, right? This isn't my best work, but we had to get it in by the deadline. How many of you have worked on production deadlines that are really fast? Yeah. Like a lot of people, yes. There's sometimes that, your product manager comes in and they're like, we need this by Tuesday. And you're like, this is like a 3-month feature. They're like, it doesn't matter, just do it. Or, something happens where they're like, oh, it's just an A/B test. We're not gonna keep it. And then cue horror music. And it lived on forever and ever and ever. Dun, dun, dun. It happens, right? That totally happens. This is a really useful comment. If I'm the maintainer of this code, it's super useful for me to come across this, and instead of envisioning the person who wrote it like it's sabotaging their morning commute or like getting vengeful, I go, oh yeah, okay, I've been in that scenario before too. And instead of sitting there trying to figure out what I should preserve, I figure out ways of refactoring that code. I say, okay, this isn't their best work clearly, I'm just gonna maybe toss this whole thing and start fresh or something like that. So this can be actually useful. It's very embarrassing to write, and that's kind of a good thing because you don't wanna lean on this as a crutch. You don't want your whole code base to be littered with things like this. That's not gonna make you a very good programmer. And then, yeah, maintainers will hate you. But this can be useful, for sure. Commenting as a teaching tool. There are definitely times where you write articles and you're doing tutorials, or let's say you're a JavaScript shop that was just given a client that's all Ruby. Maybe it's totally standard Ruby, but everyone on your team is in over its head. That might be really useful time to comment stuff so that people can understand what's going on. Learning is really humbling. If somebody is trying to parse what you're trying to say, and they need these kind of leading comments, that can be really useful for them. Comment that shit. Especially if you're doing things like tutorials, because they don't want to come to you individually for something that the code itself can tell them. It's much easier for them to read and parse. And even if you're learning, it's not just a teaching tool, it can actually be a learning tool. This person was doing 100 days of code, and they went through every line of code and commented what this tutorial was saying for each line of code. That really helped him. And it helps him because he's actually responsible for what that means for every line. It means that he actually needs to know what every line means. So that type of comment, that's not the kind of comment you keep in a production code base, but can be super helpful if you're trying to learn. I Stack Overflowed the bejesus out of this. We've all done this, right? This is not like the most proud moments of our lives, but everyone has gone into Stack Overflow at some point, found a piece of code and used it. And what I do when I do something like this is I actually put in the comment what the Stack Overflow article is, a link inside the code. And some people are shy of doing this because they'll say oh, but then I don't get credit for that piece of code. And I think that you're actually optimizing for the wrong thing, because you're really, through the process of code comments, trying to keep others moving quickly and being more productive, and even yourself. So if I look back at this in the future, and this piece of code is written in a different style than I normally would have, maybe I'm smarter later, right? Maybe I leveled up in that one particular area. I can go, oh, right, I got that from Stack Overflow. I can totally rewrite this now. Or I can revisit that Stack Overflow. Maybe somebody else answered the question a little bit better later. That happens as well. So you can always kind of have that reference to fall back on. Comments can be helpful. It's time to retire, read the fucking manual. I don't know if you've ever heard of RTFM. That's like a kind of common thing that developers use, RTFM, read the fucking manual. That's how we say like when someone comes to you and they ask you a very particular question, you can be like, come on man, just look it up. And that's kind of sometimes the basis between what we're saying when we're saying, write clean code, you don't need comments. Sometimes people will say yeah, but sometimes you do need comments. Sometimes if you put comments in a code base, you get a bunch of people on your team surreptitiously, sneakily saying thank you for doing that. That made things a lot easier. 10x developers are not actually one person that does so well that they're 10x. It's one person that enables everyone else to move that much faster. It enables 10 other developers to move more quickly and be a little bit smarter. So April Wenzel wrote this article about time to retire RTFM. It actually spoke to me because I have a little bit of this too. I've fallen into this trap. We have sometimes a survivorship bias in tech where it's well, I figured it out and you gotta figure it out now. This isn't super helpful. When we really wanna be helpful to our coworkers and ourselves, sometimes you just can mess up your future self. You write something and you know it exactly, and then 2 years later, might as well have been written by someone else. You're oh, what did I do? What was this what was going on here? So this is really helpful. This is a way to be helpful to ourselves and to other people on our code base. So this means helpful. It means, oh, you can't really see it, but this is an evacuation map that just says, good luck. And we don't want to do that in our code bases. We really want to help people maintain that code. So okay, let's talk about the bad, because I talked about the good and it sounds like I'm yeah, comments everywhere. No, not really. Actually, there are really bad comments. So let's talk about some of the ways that you can actually mess up by doing comments so that we can make sure that we don't fall into those traps as well. It's just saying what it's already doing. This is a really bad one. It's really annoying because now I'm forced to read the same thing twice in 2 different ways, and it's not giving me any new information. If I read code comments like this, I'm come on, man. Yeah, I know what a conditional is. Thank you very much. So having these kind of code comments is actually sometimes where the bad rap for code comments comes from. When you see stuff like this, you're why does anybody comment anything? Just write clean code. So try to take a step back when you're writing comments and think of it from the eyes of someone who's reading it, not from you writing it. I think these comments come from when you're writing it, you're thinking like you're writing it. And then instead of thinking about what it would look like if you're reading it, and it seems kind of okay, yeah, I get the point. So maybe, refresh yourself on that code base. It wasn't well maintained. This is a huge one. Have you ever come across a code comment that's different than the code below it describes? Yeah, that's super frustrating. It's worse than no comments at all because it's misleading. You read it and then you go, that's not what it says at all, and you feel cheated. You sit there and go, how could you do this to me? I listened to you. But part of the crux of this problem is that people don't actually think of code comments as being part of the code that they need to maintain. And that's not true. The comment is in your code. It's your job to work on it, even if that means deleting it. So if you come across a comment and you're changing a block of code, revisit that comment, and if you don't want to rewrite it, delete it. Just get rid of it. I would rather see no comment at all than something that has nothing to do with the thing that's beneath it. It's your job as a maintainer, and it's your job as a developer to update the comments as you're updating the code. We need to use the flip technique to be more performant in every browser. So remember how I talked about what is the why? If you write your codes in a more, your code comment in a more declarative manner, you actually won't need to maintain it as much. Sometimes you will, but let's say I'm using get bounding client rect as a method, and then later on I use get bbox. This still works. This is still describing the thing that I'm writing that code for. And even if I rewrite that function, it still has the same purpose. So I actually have less maintenance to do, even in the code comments, if I write them well. Hoarders, but for code. Have you ever had a coworker like this, or maybe you've been like this, where like you change something and you know the new code is good, but you just can't get rid of that old code? Like it's like, oh no, but the old code was good too. And then you just like comment it out. This is actually okay if you're continuously working on something. Maybe you just need to like refer back to it for a second. But once you're ready to ship to prod, revisit this, because this isn't necessary. Hopefully, you're all using version control, yeah? If you're using version control and writing good commit messages, yeah, you don't need to do this. You can go back and look at your code in previous versions. I promise you it's still there. GitHub goes down just for like a day, not forever, I promise. So get rid of that stuff. When you're ready and you're ready to finalize the project, go back through and omit these kind of things. You could have used a better name. This one, I actually used to do this because I wanted to be like, super cool using these like one-letter methods and blah, blah, blah. And so like you write a code comment to say what the thing does earlier on in the doc, and then later on, people are like scanning up the doc to see what that thing is. But just write a longer, just slightly, I know you don't like typing. Nobody likes typing, but we've got like VS Code does autocomplete. It's good. And this kind of thing, I don't actually have to think about this that much because it's exactly telling me what I need to know. I now know that I'm generating text geometry. I know that it's anchors. I know that I'm talking about the width and height and things like that. Where the code before it, I'm guessing a lot. I'm kind of saying, oh, okay, and maybe I need a code comment earlier on to say what that means. And those kind of code comments shouldn't be there because the names should be a little bit more meaningful. I like the rule in functional programming that if it's hard to name, it's probably because you're giving the function too much responsibility. Refactoring has helped me name, and likewise, trying to name has also helped me make my functions smaller. So aside from thinking about your code comments, thinking about naming, I know it's one of the hardest problems in computer science, but thinking about the name and giving things more meaningful names can help you from needing to write code comments in the future as well. So I really like this, tweet from Mike Kerr. The comments are an excuse for not writing the code better to begin with. Now, this is the crux of the issue for a lot of people. If you are writing code that's kind of haphazard and you're relying on your comments to tell people what it does, then your comments are actually holding back your programming. That does happen. So it's actually hard to distinguish if you're the person writing it, if you're doing that or not. It's good to check in with yourself. for that. So we lie to ourselves in myriad ways, right? We might spend the time writing a comment that could be better spent writing the code in a better way to begin with. We might also tell ourselves that we don't need to comment our code because our code is so well written that we don't need to do those kind of things, even if other people don't agree. So try to do your best. Try not to rely on one correct way, and instead write your code and then read it. Envision you're both the author and then also the maintainer, and how that code might look to you. What information would you need to be as productive as possible? What would a younger you need? What would someone else who was kind of like you need? It said that developers spent 30% of their time writing code and 70% of their time reading code. We spend way more time trying to process what that code is doing as maintainers than actually writing the code. So it's worth it to spend a little time thinking about what that process looks like when we're reading it. Yeah? So this is from Kyle Simpson, Getify. So one thing that I do, even if I'm working on a project by myself, I still submit PRs to myself, even if I'm working alone. I learned this from Stacy Kavernmo. It actually helps because when I'm reading a PR, I'm in this maintainer's mindset. When I'm thinking about reviewing, I'm not thinking about things as the same way when I'm writing the code. So it allows me to go back over the code and say, man, like I could have written this a little bit better, or like, why didn't I do this a little bit more, or anything. So like, even if I'm just working by myself, I still think of it as author and maintainer. And even if you submit code review to a team, you might want to join in that review. You might want to also be part of that review too. More than one thing can be true at a time. People tend to get on one side or the other of you should write code comments, but I would argue that the conversation isn't nuanced enough. Why not both? Hopefully, this is opening a floor for a deeper conversation to write more meaningful comments that bridge the gap. So even so, it can be a lot to parse. Get it? Parse? Anyway, I'll leave you with some better humor. A while back, there was a Stack Overflow post about the best comments that people had seen, and you can definitely waste your time in there. Here are some of my favorites. When I wrote this, only God and I understood what I was doing. Now only God knows. I dedicate this code, all my work, to my wife, Darlene, who will have to support me and our 3 children and the dog once it gets released into the public. Drunk. Fix later. First dev, images are deleted by GDI+. Second dev, I'm not sure about that. Some dev, adding temporary tracking of login screen. 5 years later, temporary my ass. I'll leave you with this example that I particularly like from Kelly Vaughn. She tweeted this out. Sometimes you need to be your own cheerleader. If you can't read it, it says, "This isn't a useful comment, but you're useful, and you can do this." That's true for all of us too. Thank you so much.